in Mark, the fact that the wine is mixed with myrrh rather than gall, I think is potentially suggestive that maybe Mark isn't so aware of the intertext. Now maybe he is, but then you have to ask why is it myrrh rather than gall, right? Why wouldn't it just be straightforward like that? So that's at least a question.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is John Anthony Dunne, who will be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Souring of the Ways, Anti-Jewish Readings of Psalm 69 and the Wine Offerings to Jesus. This was a really fun conversation. Make sure you check out his podcast. If you like what you hear from John, make sure you check out his podcast. He is part of a team of hosts for the Two Cities podcast. Without further ado, John Anthony Dunne. John Dunne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm from Las Vegas originally, born and raised, and studied in Southern California for undergrad and grad school, biblical studies, did a couple master's degrees in New Testament and Old Testament, and then did my PhD in Scotland in New Testament at the University of St. Andrews under N.T. Wright, focused on Galatians specifically. And I've been at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota for the last 6.5, almost 7 years.
So, little known New Testament scholar, N.T. Wright.
That's right.
Actually, when I threw that in there, because my actual first question is, how recalcitrant are people on the pronunciation of your home state?
Oh, I think most people just aren't sure, and so they go with Nevada because they think it sounds fancy. But that's one of those things where, as locals, we know if you're not from Nevada if you say Nevada.
I don't know if you've watched What We Do in the Shadows, but Matt Berry's character says Arizona.
Oh,
It seems like it should have some Spanish flair in there that we're not using. Okay, I'll stop being
right.
silly, at least for this part of the conversation. I'm sure it'll come back up again. We're going to be talking about your very recent article, like just over a week ago, it dropped. And a lot of people I saw on Twitter, even after I had emailed you, people were like, hey, this is a really cool title. I'm looking forward to reading this. So the article is titled The Souring of the Ways, Anti-Jewish Readings of Psalm 69 and the Wine Offerings to Jesus. Before we get into that, because there's a lot of like secondary early Christian texts cited in here.
Yeah.
But can you just walk us through those specific texts? And I can
Sure.
list them if you need to, but I'm sure you're
That's
going
all
to do.
right. Yeah, no, that's all right. So, just as a kind of quick orientation, basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at those moments in the passion narratives of the four canonical gospels where some type of wine is offered to Jesus, right? Whether it's a mixed wine, the Greek term being oinos, or whether it's a sour wine or vinegar, the term there being oxos. So in the four gospels, all four gospels have an offering of oxos or sour wine / vinegar while Jesus is on the cross. All four gospels have that. But Matthew and Mark also have a mixed wine, oinos, given to Jesus just before he's crucified, on his way with the cross, etc. And those mixed wines in Matthew and Mark are also not exactly the same thing. Mark has myrrh and Matthew has gall. Now, the sour wines that I mentioned don't have anything mixed with them. But what has happened in the reception of these texts is that everything gets simplified after a little bit of time of trying to figure out, are we dealing with multiple events, or are we dealing with, obviously we're dealing with two in the case of Matthew and Mark, but do Luke and John further complicate things where maybe Luke and John's versions aren't the same as Matthew and Mark's second versions because there are differences in details? Not least who is potentially giving the sour wine to Jesus, what their motivations were, etc. So it gets complicated and the details are like quite messy. So the natural thing to do is to simplify. And that is really what the tradition ends up doing. And so my piece is really just trying to argue what's the driving force behind that simplification? Is it strictly a matter of the details are confusing, or there's something else going on? And so my argument is that there is something else going on, and that we can see evidence of an intertext, Psalm 69, really controlling the details of that simplification.
So that's a pretty helpful segue into, so you've got these texts in the Gospels and then the text from the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 69. So what's there? And I,
Mm.
I guess maybe on its own, just reading that passage, what is there?
Yeah, so Psalm 69 is a psalm where the psalmist is really lamenting the ostracization that the psalmist has experienced relative to his kinsmen, and the ill treatment that he's experienced, including receiving sour wine or vinegar when asking for something to drink, and receiving gall when asking for food. And that is the kind of nadir of this kind of like tragic set of experiences. What follows from there is a series of imprecations, curses that are lashed out on these people who have ill treated the psalmist. But the kind of concluding section offers a vision of hope and restoration for the cities of Judah, Zion. And so there is hope at the end, but the focus, especially in the first half, is ill treatment of the psalmist, and then it switches to curses, and then it switches to hope.
The very first sentence after the abstract of this article, the offerings of mixed and sour wine to Jesus in the four canonical passion narratives are difficult to synthesize into a coherent picture. So, is that where the problem begins with the reception that you're seeing? Is it in people trying to synthesize them?
That's one of the things that I think is noticeable, because when you look at the reception, it it simplifies in a very interesting way. So there are a handful of places where the type of harmonization that we see, because the details are so disparate, is one like in the Diatessaron, which is a Syriac gospel harmony that basically puts all the material of the four gospels into kind of a single narrative, right? And what you see there is really interesting, because it presents, and there's some reconstruction that's necessary here, but it seems to present, based upon the Eastern witnesses, that the sequence of events is that there are three offerings of mixed and sour wine to Jesus, and that those three offerings essentially treat Luke and Luke's sour wine offering as a discrete event, that it is not actually Matthew and Mark's second offering, and it's not John's single offering. It's a distinctive one. And so that's a unique approach that we see. Elsewhere, when we look at the harmonies, there seems to be just the two offerings, although the details vary, and it just seems to be muddled. So you have all these different ways of getting the cat. But by and large, the way that the material simplifies and synthesizes all of it is by making the offering a singular one, and it's a mixture of sour wine and gall. Even though, again, sour wine is not mixed with anything in the four canonical gospels, and gall is actually only mentioned in Matthew, and it's his first offering. So again, it's dizzying to try to keep this all straight, but the way that it simplifies with sour wine and gall is not only, let's just take all the details of the four gospels and just make it quite easy to grasp, but that's the language that we see in Psalm 69. Verse 22 in the Hebrew Bible, verse 21 in our English Bibles, and Psalm 68:22 in the Greek. We see that language of, and in the Greek, it's the same terms of gall and sour wine. So the fact that we see that just ubiquitously over and over again, sour wine and gall, the Gospels don't give us that, but the Psalm does.
I feel like I need to back up for a minute because I have a couple
Sure.
of different threads going on in my brain. So I remember reading years ago, and I think it was F. Bruce talking about early on in Greek, they would say the gospel in reference to these four documents. Is that like a separate line of thinking for harmonies? And can you give me a sense of what is the lifespan of the attempt to harmonize gospels? Because I remember my first Bible noticing that we had charts. So it would be
Mhm.
like this story's here and this story's here and this one's not in this one. But that seems like a pretty modern 20th, 21st century kind of thing. So is there a lifespan for harmonies of the gospels?
Yeah, so some of the people that we know from antiquity and late antiquity who were harmonizing include Tatian, who created the Diatessaron. It's possible that there were precursors to this, and there's some discussion about that. There's other people that are mentioned that we know that they were known for harmonizing, but we don't have their extant works. But then people that we have Juven Proba, Augustine, and I might be blanking just now, but we do have people from antiquity and late antiquity who were creating harmonies. We also have, depending on how you think about what Eusebius was doing with the canons, we his work is at least a kind of harmonizing work, whether or not it counts as harmony. Yeah, and it continues on. Calvin made a harmony, and in the contemporary setting, in the 20th century, you can find a lot of different harmonies. And I think the impulse makes sense, right? We have these four gospels. They are telling the same story, and yet they're telling different stories. And how do we account for those differences, right? Do we treat them, when there are differences, do we treat them as separate events or as the same event with different details? And then we create like a new kind of conflated event in our harmony, right? Or do we pull them apart and say, no, these are distinct things? That's a tendency that I think comes from a very natural impulse. And so you see it. You see it in official harmonies, but you also see it in, like I said, these references to the Passion event. And of course, I'm just dealing with a very minor incident, ostensibly, in terms of these mixed and sour wines. But that could explain why people could so casually make reference to something that's not actually in any of our Gospels, because it's not something that people it's not something that's going to stand out to people so clearly as a discrete event. It's just, oh yeah, sour wine and gall. Yeah, yeah, that happened, even though it didn't, in terms of those specific details.
Okay, so we've touched on the texts, the passion narratives. We've talked about Psalm 69. Now, how aside from the fact that the psalmist is saying, "Look, my kinsmen have
Mhm.
treated me poorly," how do we get to an anti-Jewish reading of
Mm.
that?
It's a great question. So, what I try to do in the article is I try to point out that when you look at Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John discreetly, individually, you don't see a lot of awareness, or at least consistent awareness, of the psalm intertext. For example, in Mark, the fact that the wine is mixed with myrrh rather than gall, I think is potentially suggestive that maybe Mark isn't so aware of the intertext. Now, maybe he is, but then you have to ask, why is it myrrh rather than gall? Why wouldn't it just be straightforward like that? So that's at least a question. You at least have to point out that it's not straightforwardly the case that Mark is obviously alluding to this text. However, Matthew has access to Mark, right? And when Matthew is doing his version of these events, it does say gall. And I suspect that one reason could be the Magi give myrrh to Jesus, so we don't want to have myrrh appearing again. Although it would make a great bookend, and it would be ironic, and that could actually be really nice, right? But I suspect that might have one thing to do with why Matthew doesn't have it. But the other one, I think the more obvious one, is the fact that the psalm does. So I think Matthew is aware of it. But the issue is the motivation in the psalm. The motivation is clearly mocking and to treat the psalmist poorly. Whereas that doesn't seem to be the case with at least the second offering in Matthew. So in the first offering, it does appear to be torturous, harmful. It seems like the soldiers are trying to harm Jesus. They're not trying to, as some people have suggested, offer an analgesic to him. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that makes sense of what the soldiers are trying to do there. They're trying to kill him. And so I don't think it's an analgesic, this mixture of gall, which is poison, right, with or something bitter with wine. I don't see as an analgesic. So that seems to be mocking to me, and that seems to fit the psalmist's context of what's the intentions behind the sour wine and the gall in the psalm, but not in the second offering. In the second offering, it's linked in both Matthew and Mark with the cry of dereliction. My God, why have you forsaken me? And what happens is people think in both Matthew and Mark, they think that Jesus is calling out to Elijah because he's saying, Eloi, Eloi. And so they think he's calling out to Elijah. And somebody, a bystander, so probably a Jewish person, thinks to get some sour wine for him and to offer it to him. And there's a detail that in Mark and Matthew are slightly different. In Matthew, I think it's the crowds say, "Wait, let's see if Elijah comes down and saves him." And in Mark, it's the person who has the sour wine who says it. So it's a slight difference, but the saying is repeated. It's just who's saying it. And the question is, does that actually change the motivation a little bit? So the person who says it, wait, let's see if Elijah's going to come. It's let's keep him alive long enough to see if Elijah's going to come. Whereas in the other gospel, it's like the bystanders are like, no, 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 don't interfere. Let's see if Elijah is going to come and save him. So there's a slightly different nuance. So there's some ambiguity about the offering itself. Is it intended to be harmful or not? That lack of consistency, at least, raises questions about whether the psalm is really motivating it, because it's clearly mocking in the psalm. So I just raised that as an example of a perceived lack of awareness, I would say, of the intertext influence. When we go to Luke, Luke only has the one offering. So if Luke has access to Mark and potentially access to Matthew, that's the debate within the synoptic problem. Does Luke have access to Matthew? If Luke has access to Mark and Matthew, it's really curious why he would omit the first offering slash omit reference to gall, because that would make it so explicit that Luke understands that there's an intertext here. So there's no reference. It's just sour wine. There's no reference to gall. There's no initial offering. It's just a single offering. Now, what makes it fit with the context of the psalm is that the soldiers are doing this mockingly. It's very explicit in Luke that they're doing it mockingly. Now, it's the soldiers who are doing it, not the bystanders. So again, that's where the details, where you can see why the diatessaron would make this a distinct event. But they're doing it mockingly, overtly so. That fits the context, the immediate context of the intertext in the psalm. But again, you don't have all the nice verbal links. Luke even steps away from verbal links because in Matthew and Mark, you have the use of the Greek term to cause to drink or to make to drink. You don't get that in Luke. Has different terms, and so you have actually less verbal agreement. So Luke seems to be less aware in some ways, although again, the mocking is more overt. When you get to John, John is super interesting because you don't have reference to gall, but the sour wine is overtly connected to fulfilling scripture, right? Jesus says, I thirst, which is what the Septuagint says, that it was given for thirst. So that to me, I think, is a nice sort of reflection of the psalm. You don't have the gall though, but it says that this was done knowing that the scripture was fulfilled or whatever. That is the only gospel that overtly connects what's happening to scriptural fulfillment. We don't know which scripture is being fulfilled, but we have to think it's Psalm 69, or at least Psalm 69 is contributing potentially to a kind of scriptural set of texts that are being fulfilled. Some people think it's more holistic, like to fulfill all scripture or something like that, rather than a particular text. I think Psalm 69 has to be part of this mix. But what I would say that's striking is John doesn't seem to have a mocking motivation for the sour wine. You have somebody saying that they're thirsty, and then a person gives it to them. And that kind of response to somebody who claims to be thirsty, at least in John, it doesn't come across as being mocking. Some people disagree with that. They think it is mocking, but it's just not clear. So then taking a step back, so we've just done this little run through, taking a step back, we don't see the broader context of the psalm reflected. And between the four of them, we don't really get a clear grasp on who's really aware of the intertext. Matthew and John probably are the most aware. Luke and Mark are perhaps less aware, if there's a spectrum. At the very least, they're all, if they are appropriating it, they're doing so atomistically, meaning it's the wording, it's the specific text, it's its immediate context, not really its broader context. We don't really see evidence of that. However, when this gets appropriated in later tradition and it gets simplified with the sour wine and gall, which again is from the psalm, not from any of the gospels, when that gets simplified, the broader context of the psalm starts to be leveraged. All those imprecations that I was mentioning, all those curses, those start to now be applied to the people giving the sour wine and gall. But what happens is, who's giving the sour wine and gall? It's quote unquote the Jews. It's this kind of wholesale critique of a people for giving sour wine and gall, even though, again, it's the soldiers who are giving the first offering in Matthew and Mark. It's the soldiers who are giving the offering in Luke. And we're not exactly sure who these in with the other examples. But the tradition simplifies, where it becomes the Jews who did it, and it becomes the sour wine mixed with gall, which is from the psalm. And so then the psalm provides these curses to then immediately start polemicizing against the Jewish people for being culpable for this act. And that's how it's understood. And that's true of other elements of the Passion, to be clear. But we see this specifically take place with the intertext with Psalm 69.
So the people trying to highlight this anti-Jewish reading in relation to Psalm 69, do they read Psalm 69 and teach on that? Is there exegesis of that passage when they get to it as a psalm? Does it still represent that?
So the best examples that we have here are the commentaries on the Psalms, and there are a handful of people: Augustine, Cassiodorus, a few others, Theodoret of Cyrus. We have a few different people who've written commentaries on the Psalms, and what's really sad is when you get to those imprecations, there's very clear connections being made. This is why your temple was destroyed, because you gave sour wine and gall to Jesus. This is why, etc. So the curses in that section of the psalm are really profound. And the commentators are just saying all of this, kind of applies to the Jewish people because of what they did. They gave Jesus sour wine and gall, which is really problematic for so many reasons, not least because the Gospels don't do anything like that, but because it's part of their polemicizing. It's part of their just sort of wholesale critiques of the Jewish people, and it's anti-Jewish. But where this gets even wilder is the final section of the psalm is about hope, and it's specifically about restoration of Zion and Judah and all this stuff. And that is just not how the early Christians are reading it. When they get to that part, they apply it to true Israelites or to the church specifically. And so there is no hope for restoration, because they're just bifurcating the psalm in a way where it's like, these curses apply to the Jewish people because of what they've done, and this hope now applies to the church. And so there is no sense of restoration from their reading of the psalm. It's just wholesale critique for their offering of sour wine and gall to Jesus.
No one. So no one was reading it. No one was reading it differently than that?
I if somebody has an example, that'd be great, but I don't have one.
That's a bummer.
Yeah.
I know that's an understatement.
No, it is. It is.
Wow.
It's a sad history. That's basically what I would describe here is it's really gnarly. I am trying to lay out a really sad history of unfortunate hermeneutical moves. And it's important to recognize that and also to think through the legacy of that as well. So that's the really the heart behind the piece is to call it out for being egregious and to think through, especially as Christian interpreters, to think through the ways in which we can fall into all kinds of weird pitfalls and maybe not even recognize the historical development of some of these really problematic readings. And like I said, I don't think that the New Testament authors are participating in this, though. That's one of the other points that I try to highlight is we don't see imprecations from the Psalms at all in those four Gospels applied to anyone. Obviously not to the Jews, but that's because they're more sophisticated in who's giving the sour wine and the mixed wine to Jesus. The places where we do see those imprecations from the Psalms applied at all are like with Acts, we see it applied to Judas. Judas receives the imprecations of those Psalms. That's an interesting thing in Acts. In Revelation and in Philippians, there's the language of the book of life and being blotted out or written in, but also language of blotted out. That seems to come from that psalm. In no way is that applied to the Jewish people. It's just broad references to the book of life. What is interesting, though, is in Romans 11, this is that part of that famous set of chapters where Paul is wrestling with is God being faithful to his people. And it culminates with this affirmation that all Israel will be saved, right? There's this partial hardening. The nations are coming in. All Israel will be saved, right? Romans 11, that's the kind of climax there. In Romans 11, there is a citation of Psalm 69, one of those imprecations, but that's applied to unbelieving Israel. Obviously, it doesn't apply to Paul. It doesn't apply to the remnant that Paul's been talking about. And the other important thing is it's not connected to the sour wine tradition at all. And as well, in subsequent sort of commentaries on Romans 11 and use of Romans 11, no one's adding sour wine stuff to that comment section. When they get to that, they're not like, "Oh, that's because of the sour wine stuff." So I point that out because I don't think that Paul is leading people to make these connections. It's more like the sour wine tradition has made people make those connections because of the psalm intertext. It's not how the New Testament uses the imprecations. They're doing something unique.
So this is like a secondary theologizing of, actually, it would be like tertiary, right? Because the
Mm.
Gospels are like secondary after Hebrew
Mm.
Bible texts.
Hmm.
Okay. Is that a helpful way of understanding it?
Sure, it could be. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the Gospels, you have a very superficial use of Psalm 69. If we even have that, like I said, I'm a little skeptical about how much Mark and Luke are really drawing upon it. But let's just, even if we just say all four of them are drawing upon it, what are they drawing upon? My point is, it's more atomistic, it's more narrow, it's more specific to the kind of wording of this passage. One verse out of the 37 or so, where it talks about this sour wine and this gall. It's not the broader context. And I think that's important. And I think it just shows that Psalm 69 isn't doing a whole lot for the gospel authors, but it does a whole lot for early Christians. And what it does is unfortunate, to say the least.
This probably is, and if it is, please shut this down. It could be an anachronistic understanding, but reading Mark Knoll's History of the Bible in America, he talks about how so much of American rhetoric has been couched, political language, all that kind of thing, has been couched in what we see as biblical language, which would historically be like King James type language. And that if you wanted to get a hearing, if you wanted people to pay attention or take you seriously, you would speak that way, you would write that way, you would communicate that way. And you mentioned the Septuagint. Is that a similar relationship for them, that yes, there is a theological significance always, but there's also a literary or rhetorical significance to using it.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure about that comparison. It's an interesting question. I guess what I would say when they are using that language from the Septuagint, I don't know that they are consciously doing so in the sense of, oh, this is an archaizing or like biblicizing way of talking, and we're recognizing that's what's happening, or I'm doing that intentionally. I think it's more like once once the psalm intertext was recognized and leveraged, it just became ubiquitous how people thought about it. And I think they probably think they're referring to the four gospels. You know what I mean? I don't think they're often thinking of the Septuagint or thinking of the I just think, especially with all the examples that I provide of the kind of shorthand references to sour wine and gall, I think they're often just thinking that's what the gospels say because they're not double checking or whatever. They're just there's the tradition has so solidified itself as sour wine and gall, and that tradition includes culpability of Jewish people and specific condemnation or indictment of the Jewish people for doing it. And I think the psalm is what gave rise to all of that. But I think a lot of people are probably just thinking that they are actually referring to the Gospels. I'm sure a lot of them thought that is what the Gospels say. And in fact, it is what the Gospels say eventually in some texts because variants creep in. So in Matthew, the oxos replaces the oinos in the first offering. So that's one of the variants that we have. So instead of wine mixed with gall for Matthew's first offering, it's sour wine mixed with gall. Because isn't that perfect? The only place where gall is actually mentioned in the canonical tradition, I should say, like originally, um, there we see oxos creep into the variants. It makes sense, right? So in one sense, it does become part of the gospel tradition because that is what we see later on. We also see this in John. In John, he just has oxos, right? But we see with gall, metahales, added to some texts and in some variants. In other words, the psalm intertext becomes so prominent that it also does change the tradition of how the text is being transmitted, not just how people are referring to it. That's ubiquitous. We see that over and over again, sour wine and gall, but also the text itself. It becomes it becomes something that looks more like the psalm. Yeah, and actually, this is true with the manuscripts of Psalm 69 because in the Latin, instead of the gall being given for food, there's a tradition where it's potum. The gall is given for a drink, which has to be backwards influence of the gospel tradition of Jesus receiving gall in Matthew, of course, in the form of a drink, right? Mixed with wine.
Which is its own form of Jewish erasure to just try
Mm.
and say, "Yeah, this text belongs to us. This is about Jesus now. Whatever it
Oh,
was,
sure. Yeah.
whatever it
Yeah.
was about, it's not about that anymore." I do want to clarify so my question was more: are the
Hmm.
authors of the Gospels using
Oh, I see.
Septuagint, or even actually? So I was wondering for a while there: do we see in any of the Gospels a Hebrew Bible as opposed to a Septuagint, like Greek version of the Hebrew Bible?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But actually, so you gave me a better frame for the early Christian reception, which is like every once in a while I'll see one of those listicles that's like 20 movie quotes we all get wrong. And that's not what
Oh, yeah,
Darth Vader said.
exactly.
It seems like
Exactly.
that's what they
Yeah.
did. But I
Yeah.
do wonder, is there a literary or rhetorical influence from biblical texts that they had at their disposal, whether they're Hebrew from memory or liturgy or from reading or Septuagint? And then is there a distinction between an influence from one or the other on the Greek New Testament in this case?
Yeah, so in this case, I think partly because the nature of my argument, I'm saying there's very little correspondence. But when you're dealing with intertextuality, you're always curious about what the Vorlagen are, what lays before the evangelists or any author, right? What kind of text are they looking at? And maybe even looking at is not accurate because in some cases they're not actively drawing upon literal physical text. They might be recalling from memory. they they might be translating something, a different Hebrew tradition, because there is textual pluriformity, so we have to keep that in mind too. So it gets pretty complicated. But are they translating a Hebrew tradition? Are they looking at a different Greek tradition than what we call, quote unquote, the Septuagint? So these are important issues. Are they, recalling from memory, etc.? Those are important questions. So we do have to be careful. But I think there's just not enough to really say what they are doing. I do point out parallels with the Septuagint, and so that's an issue to consider. But the terms, we're really just dealing with hale for gall, oxos for sour wine, and then for cause to drink, or even a form of didomy, edokun, that we see they gave. There's not a lot of verbal correspondence here with the Septuagint. Those are some of the terms that I point out in the piece. But whether or not the Hebrew Bible could have contributed to the form of these references, I'm not sure. It would be a much more robust conversation if it was a quotation where we have multiple words, and if there was like an introductory formula, thus it says, or and so it was fulfilled what was said in the prophet. If
I
we
mean,
have an intro
there is something like that, but then it doesn't tell you what it's talking about.
in the case of John, to fulfill scripture, that's the best, but it's not quite an introductory formula. But yes, it is the only place where this tradition is linked to scriptural fulfillment. And so that is absolutely true. But it would be wonderful if there was a quotation that followed, right? Because in some ways, John is maybe quotation is "I thirst." That's what Jesus says, and then he's given oxos, and so there are verbal parallels there because of the thirst language in the Greek, but it's still very superficial. Is my point? It's still very superficial. Yeah. Yeah, so we don't have a great example of Luke, I am your father versus just I am your father, right? Which is the point you were bringing up with the Star Wars quote that we get wrong. There isn't a great example of that where, oh no, that shows more of the Hebrew Bible's influence than the Septuagint's. Unfortunately, there's just not enough here to really run with.
That's fair. And look, you can say pass to this question because I understand you are not here as a classicist. But okay, being as these are Greek texts, is there an analog for something else roughly in that era where you have several different texts saying similar things and we run into this kind of an issue?
We have plenty of issues of textual pluriformity where when we look, especially like in with Hebrew, because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, great evidence of pluriformity there internal to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also how the Dead Sea Scrolls relate to later Hebrew tradition like the Masoretic text, but then Septuagintal traditions, and then when you factor in quotations and stuff, that kind of adds to this issue of pluriformity, because are they quoting, let's say, verbatim? And if they are, and it's different from the Septuagint, then that is evidence of a different tradition. But at the same time, authors are free to tweak things. And it seems, for example, there are a number of places where in the New Testament, an author will slightly change the grammar because of the wording of how the text is applying to the situation. There's a handful of examples of that. Yeah, I'm being broad because I think there are so many examples, and which one do you want to start with, kind of thing. There are a lot of examples where texts are different. This specific issue is very particular because we are dealing with ostensibly a very minor incident in the Passion narratives that we rush past, probably most of us. And the details are so different between the four Gospels, and then so different still in the reception of it. So that, I think, it's a very distinctive thing. And I think probably because it's so quote unquote minor, I think that's why we see so much variation.
So it seems like I may be putting words in your mouth. It seems like you're saying it's important when you approach whether if you're reading one of the gospels, because I don't know about you, but I can only read one at a time. And I come to this part of the narrative, just take that one as it comes on its own. And then when you go to the
Mm.
next one, do the same thing.
So there's obviously a place for canonical reading, and there's a place for thinking through the four gospels together as a collection. And that's an intuitive thing. That's something that Christians do and have always done. And that's where harmonizing projects come from, right? Is it's just doing that with more formality. And I think probably for the average Christian, these aren't four individual stories, right? These are one stories. And what happens is a lot of Christians aren't aware or familiar with, oh, only Luke tells that parable. Or, oh, that's a feature that we only see in John. Or that's a feature we do not see in John. You know, um, I think a lot of Christians are maybe surprised when you say stuff like that because they're not entirely sure where stuff comes from. It's just the stories about Jesus. We have a collection of four sets of stories about Jesus. And so I do try to emphasize the unique nature of each gospel and try to highlight what each of them are doing because they're each telling a story. They each have particular theological interests and they're trying to paint a portrait for us of what Jesus was like. And and I think it's important to attend to those things as a Christian and as an educator, as a New Testament professor. That's something that I emphasize. What is Mark doing? What is Matthew doing? Etc. And so I also only read one gospel at a time, but I think that when we're doing that, we should be attentive to what is this gospel doing? For example, I often hear people say that Mark is pretty boring and pretty uninteresting compared to Matthew and Luke. And I just think if you have this broad view where you are always thinking of what Matthew adds that you find more interesting or what Luke adds that you find more interesting, then you might find Mark to be boring. But if you can set that aside and just read Mark as a like novel kind of thing, like on its own, I find Mark so interesting and compelling because of all the things that Matthew and Luke adds. I think you miss how strange the story is in Mark and how wild it is and how the themes uniquely develop in Mark. And so I actually find Mark super, super compelling. But I feel if you have strictly a kind of like canonical and harmonizing approach to the gospels, you're going to find Mark to be the least interesting because you're going to think, oh, he's just cut out so much, even though that's not the right way to think about the development of the gospels. But you're just going to think, oh, Mark is just the Reader's Digest version. I want Matthew and I want Luke or I want John. But I think if we can set that aside, I just think Mark pops when we treat it on its own. And that's something I love is, yeah, attending to each of them respectively.
I think the thing I'm concerned with is if I were to talk to my teenage son and he basically says,
Yeah.
just wrote this paper and what my sources say is this, and no, that's your thesis. That's
Mm.
not your source's thesis. And if it is your source's thesis, you plagiarized it, but that's not really relevant here. But here to say the gospels say, do
Mm.
they? Like it may be in there, but I don't know that they do. And so it's one text at a time. And I didn't want to be presumptuous. I assume you're a better student than I was because you made it much farther in education than I have. But all of that is to say, this is a podcast about biblical texts, and I want people to take those texts as they come. And I understand that there may be a reference to Psalm 69, but it gets my dander up the idea that people will read back on something and say, this belongs to us now, so we get to tell you what it means. And this is about Jesus.
Mm.
And also, you guys are villains. And that's
Mm.
just my
Mm.
kind of that's my kind of
Yeah.
rant about that.
Yeah.
So for
It's
indulging me.
Oh, no, it's good. And what I would say is because I don't see the Gospels as implicating quote unquote the Jews for the sour wine tradition, and I don't see them leveraging the curses of the context. That's a subsequent development of the tradition. I think that we should do with Psalm 69 what the Gospels do if they're doing much with it, which is they're just linking this experience of the psalmist being ill treated with Jesus being ill treated. That's as far as we get, if we get anything from it, right? And like I said, I think Matthew and John are doing something more so than, if there's a spectrum to it, more so than Mark and Luke. But it's what early Christians subsequently do with this. that's where I want to draw the line as far as what do we do if we recognize the intertext? Because there's an irony here. So Richard Hayes, wonderful New Testament scholar who's written a lot on intertextuality, and he has a specific book on intertextuality in the Gospels, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, or something like that. And when he talks about Psalm 69, he says, hey, look, the psalm ends with this wonderful vision of the national deliverance of the people. So that means that when we're thinking about the narrative of the Gospels and its use of Psalm 69, we should think about how Jesus's resurrection is part of this like broader picture of the potential national deliverance of the people. Jesus is like a part for the whole, or something along those lines. But he has this kind of very positive reading where it's like, oh, this is a great sort of, all the gospel authors have to really do is dip their toes in this and look at the ripple effect that leads to this national deliverance at the end of the psalm. That's beautiful, and it fits the narrative arc of the gospels, and it is beautiful, it's lovely. I just don't think the gospel authors are doing that. But more importantly, and this is the heart of my piece, it is not what any of the early Christians do. They do not read it that way. They do not make those connections. They do not see national deliverance as part of the picture of the intertext. And yeah, I would love to make the kinds of connections that Richard Hayes does, but the unfortunate truth is that early Christians did not read it that way.
That is unfortunate. That appropriately is a sour note to end things on. But yeah, got him.
Well played.
On that note, though, where would you send people to read, to listen, to watch, to get a better understanding of this subject or any other subject in biblical studies or New Testament studies? So I know that's a lot, but where would you send people?
I love intertextuality, so there's a lot of great books on intertextuality, New Testament use of the Old. My main thing is there isn't a one size fits all. People have developed methodologies, and some people insist that when a New Testament author uses the Old Testament, it looks like this or that every time. I think there's a lot of different kinds of uses, and I think there's a lot of different kind of appropriations of broader context. So for me, it's really a case by case basis. There are a number of great studies on this. I mentioned Richard Hayes. He has a couple of great books. There's a new book coming out with Baker by a colleague and friend, Doug Huffman, with Baker. And I think it has a title that's something like The New Testament Use of the Old Testament, but it's meant to be like a new methodological sort of approach. And there are other great resources there. So I really recommend that if you're interested in intertextuality. But obviously, as it pertains to this particular issue, it's so niche. Not a lot of people write about this. So my article, which just came out in JBL, the Journal of Biblical Literature, if listeners are interested, can check that out. I do get into the weeds a little bit, but hopefully just to make the case crystal clear about what I think is going on. But yeah,
Getting into the weeds is what academic articles are for.
that's true. That's true.
That's where a lot of other work is generated. So I hope to
Yeah.
see other people following the path that you've cut on this, because this was an interesting
Oh,
article.
cheers.
Now, what do you read
Great.
for fun?
Oh, beautiful question.
Thank you.
Yeah, shifting gears hard. So I'm a total nerd when it comes to what do I read for fun? So right now though, I'm co-writing a book on Jesus films with my colleague Janine Brown. And speaking of the sour wine and mixed wine, it's really interesting to see what the Jesus films do. They typically have a single offering, and it's really fascinating though to see how the film versions of the Jesus films treat this material. But because I'm doing that, I've really been watching so many Jesus films recently, and really esoteric, obscure ones, made for DVD ones back in the day, like straight to DVD. But I've been wanting to read widely on different stories about Jesus or stories that include Jesus. And when I'm not reading for research, although I would argue that's fun, I view it as fun, but it's still research. I'm a big Harry Potter fan, and I do love rereading Harry Potter.
There are 3 sets of Harry Potter books in this house, because actually there might be 4. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Between all the kids,
Wow.
and then I have mine. I think, yeah. Look, we like fantasy in this household.
Yeah.
Look, hey, if it's fun. So is there something you've been reading for research that particularly stands out?
One of the things that I have yet to read, which is probably a mistake on my part, I'm about to jump into The Master and Margarita, which I'm excited to check out. There's some Jesus stuff in there. And let's see. I think that's the main fictional one. So I've been reading a lot more kind of like essays on Jesus films and things like that. I also have Shusaku Endo's Life of Jesus that I'm excited to read as well. I think Scorsese has flirted with the idea of making another Jesus film based on that. Endo is the author of Silence, which Scorsese made a film about. Interested to see if Scorsese is going to go down that route. So I'm going to make sure I read it in anticipation of that.
Okay, fun. Unless you have anything else, I'm going to call this one good.
Sounds great.
Appreciate you being here, man. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Here is a clip of next week's episode, which is my conversation with Ant B. Greenham. He is one of the editors of a book called Islam and the Bible. This is the first of 5 episodes discussing that book. So he is an editor, not a contributor. So conversation is a little bit more broad. The 4 conversations after his are with contributors. And so things do get a little bit more specific about their contribution to the book. Hope you come back next week to listen to that conversation. Take care.
So, with your question on the what are Muslim idiom translations, I'd like to suggest that they are well intentioned. Here's the thing: you have a long-standing uphill battle of missionaries to the Muslim world over the last 1400 years to present the message of Christ, and for the most part, it's been met with utter rejection, and next to nobody has embraced the gospel of Christ. So there's like this wall that has been presented by the Muslim world over the centuries, and the concern of missiologists is to ask the question: is there a way we could present the gospel in a way that makes more sense to Muslims?